Mi gente, hello and welcome to Kica's Corner. My name is Kica Matos and I am your host. The goal for this show is to focus on interesting topics or people, social justice issues, and maybe a scandal or two. But always, 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 whatever we talk about will always have a social justice edge. Today we're going to talk about a hot topic, and that's the border. What's happening? Why? What is fake news and what is real? Let me just do a little bit of framing to get us started before I introduce my guest and we have a conversation. For months now, we know the airwaves have been filled with all of these sensational stories about migrants arriving at the border, looking to enter the U.S. Many of us followed the progress of a caravan of a few thousand Central Americans as they made their way to the U.S.-Mexican border. Their goal? It was really simple: to flee from the violence they face in their home countries and come to the U.S. to seek asylum. Our government's response to the asylum seekers has basically been to ignore the law and try to block people from coming to the U.S. and applying for asylum. Because of this, we now have a humanitarian crisis at the border where there is a lot of human suffering. And of course, related to this, we have a government shutdown, which is now entering its 34th day. It's the longest in U.S. history. And Trump asserts that until he gets $6 billion to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, the government will continue to be closed. In the studio with me today is a fierce advocate, and I'm happy to say that he's a friend of mine. He knows more about these issues, quite frankly, than anyone else I know. His name is Oscar Chacon, and he's the executive director of Alianza Americas, which is a badass organization that's dedicated to creating an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable way of life for Latino immigrant communities living both here in the U.S. and across the Americas. Oscar is originally from El Salvador, but he's actually based in Chicago. He's traveled extensively throughout Central America, and Alianza is the lead organization working transnationally, which means that the work doesn't just impact the U.S., but it also impacts the Americas. Oscar, welcome to the show. Bienvenido.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Muchas gracias por invitarme. It's always an honor.
Thank you. Gracias a ti. So, Oscar, let's start with the caravan. Why, where did it start and why?
Sure. Well, the caravans were triggered by an exhaustion, if you want, a pattern of increasing difficulty for people in Central America who are literally fleeing for their lives to be able to find a way of making the world know that their situation is horrible and that they deserve protection and refuge. The caravans were actually organized at the beginning in a very spontaneous and decentralized manner. And people have to understand that the notion of traveling together in a terrain, in a journey, in a pathway that is full of difficulties and obstacles, and I cannot even begin to describe how bad that is. It's actually very appealing, the idea of traveling together with a bunch of people, countrywomen and countrymen of yours, that can protect each other by traveling together. That was really the very original triggering reasons that led for these caravans to take place. The very first one left Honduras on the 12th of October, and they are the people who are now amassing, by and large, in Tijuana, trying to wait for an opportunity to apply for asylum in the U.S. And of course, I mean, needless to say that behind this very last set of factors that triggered the caravans, because there are now more caravans since the first one from October 12th, there is a very persistent systemic condition of economic, social oppression that has been part of the reality of these people in Central American countries for centuries. But that aside, I mean, the reality today is one characterized by horrible acts of violence committed by a collection of forces, including, of course, gangs, including narco trafficking, criminal organizations, and also abusive government forces that often also become part of the problem in as far as creating an environment of violence and insecurity that drives people out.
So, Oscar, the statistics that the UN and other agencies have put out point to the fact that the homicide rates in some of these Central American countries are the highest in the world. How did we
Mhm.
get there?
Well, it is the sad combination of multiple factors. Going back, honestly, to the fact that these are countries that during the 1980s were engulfed in civil wars that came to an end, formally speaking, in the 1990s, in 1992 in El Salvador, 1996 in Guatemala. Honduras, even though it didn't have an open civil war, it was actually the platform from where the U.S. played a very central role in those civil wars, again, throughout the 1980s and early 90s. Then, we have a situation that in many ways you could understand if you understand the idea of putting more wood into fire. U.S. Policies having to do with deportation became extremely strict, especially combined with changes in criminal law in California. To make a long story short, a lot of people who came from Central American countries became involved with gangs that are U.S. originated, U.S. based gangs, began to be deported in increasing numbers to especially El Salvador and to a lesser degree Honduras and Guatemala. So when you add these factors and then you also add the changing dynamics of narco trafficking in South America, Central America, Mexico, you have basically an explosive situation where many factors have converged to indeed come to where we are today. A situation where El Salvador and Honduras usually fight with each other for which country will come out as the highest homicidal rate country in the world. And that is where we are. I mean, add to this the fact that the very governments there have been, frankly, largely unable to understand and properly address these issues. They have been neglectful in as far as not changing enough, in as far as creating economic and social opportunity. And so the end result is this environment of deep, deep-seated, super bloody violence that, again, I insist, is the primary reason that explains why so many people are fleeing in spite of the conditions they face in the route towards the U.S.
And so, because of this, we have thousands of people who are now trying to come to the U.S. And unfortunately, if you're to believe this current administration, they're painting a picture of these violent, lawless people. Some of them are terrorists, some of them are carrying disease, and they're all looking to come to the U.S. when in fact, the story in the border is very different. People are turning themselves in and they're actively wanting to seek asylum. Talk to us a little bit about what our own government's obligations are under the law when it comes to asylum.
But let me just echo something you were commenting about. By and large, the narrative that has been put forward by the Trump administration is frankly nothing but flat lies in as far as almost every area that he has used, to basically scare people, to plant fear, to cause rejection, to these people that are, as I said earlier, seeking safety, seeking protection. International law and U.S. law is been very clear. For nearly 4 decades, we have had an asylum law that precisely understands that when people are fleeing in a hurry, fleeing without planning to flee because they were forced to do so, they indeed will often rely on having to enter the country without inspection, without any visa, and they apply for asylum upon arrival to our borders. And then the asylum system normally processes those applications. People historically were not necessarily put in jail or in detention while those applications are being processed. Lately, and I mean not only the Trump administration years, but even before, we've been increasingly putting people in detention while they are figuring out what kind of form of protection they should apply for. But the bottom line is the Trump administration now is absolutely violating the letter and the spirit of the asylum law now in place, surely ignoring international obligations, which clearly state that people fleeing conditions like those that are well documented in the cases of Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and increasingly Nicaragua, should actually receive protection, be allowed to apply for asylum, be allowed to go free while their applications are being processed. And again, I mean, the evidence clearly shows that when we treat people that way, people show up for the dating court that the U.S. asylum system usually issues within sometimes months, sometimes years. But the bottom line is we honor the fact that people are fleeing persecution and danger, and that's why they are coming to our country.
You're listening to Kica's Corner on WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio, broadcast at 103.5 FM and live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. Oscar, Alianza was one of the first organizations to respond in a really thoughtful, comprehensive way to the crisis in the border. And the campaign that you launched in partnership with a few other organizations is called Refuge for Families. Talk to us a little bit about the campaign and its goals.
Well, the campaign comes to be precisely as the first caravan became known. And we, several leaders, including those in Alianza Americas, understood that this was the new phase of migration, the new phase of collective human mobility in the Central America, Mexico, U.S. corridor, and that it was imperative to respond not only by preparing ourselves for the arrival of these people in the U.S., but also acknowledging that there was a very uncertain situation that these people were going to be facing as they crossed through Guatemala, Mexico. And therefore, the campaign came to be with the hope and with the goal of actually responding to the needs that people are facing while migrating, primarily in the Mexican territory, but also beginning to prepare for the eventual arrival of these folks in the U.S. And the partnering organizations, Community Change, the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, the National We Are All America Alliance Coalition, and the National Partnership for New Americans are organizations that have begun to understand better, I believe, in the context of this emergency, the fact that the real question we need to understand and tackle is why are these folks leaving their countries? What's pushing them out? Because if we only deal with folks upon their arrival to the U.S., we are only dealing at best, with half of the challenge. And I believe that the work done so far, providing support to shelters in Mexico, visiting some of these shelters, and raising awareness every place we have been able to, is exactly the kind of work that we need to do. Clearly, there is so much more that needs to be done. We need to take this opportunity to hopefully change the way we talk about migration and human mobility dynamics, not only in the U.S. Congress, but every place we can possibly bring this message to, because I believe it's crucial for us to seize the moment to precisely change the narrative and come up with new ideas on how we can possibly contribute to solving these challenges.
So, Oscar, I know you've traveled extensively and you have heard the stories of the suffering of a lot of caravan travelers. Is there a particular story that stays with you?
Well, I mean, there are so many, to tell you the truth. However, I mean, I think that one of the most heartbreaking stories, I would put them in two sets. One is the stories of children. I mean, I think children very often become indeed people very misunderstood because, in the U.S., I've heard so many times people saying, how can a parent possibly put their children in such a danger? And that is because they're not asking themselves the question, why are they leaving? What's so bad that in spite of the dangers, they prefer to bring their kids along rather than leaving them behind and be exposed to the dangers they are precisely running away from? That's one set of stories that are always heartbreaking. And the other one that really breaks my heart is to see young people, not even 20 sometimes, who in the hope of getting to the U.S. become injured because sometimes they fall asleep while riding a train. Their legs are cut off, by the train. And so their life is forever changed in a way that is absolutely challenging. And to hear those stories, to talk to those people, believe me, makes anybody cry. If you take the time to really hear why they have done all this, again, you can do nothing else but sympathize with these particular challenges people are facing.
Let me pivot now and talk a little bit about the government shutdown and the fight over the border wall. It seems that one of the so-called solutions that this administration has fixated on to address the humanitarian crisis in the border is to try to secure nearly $6 billion to build this wall that Trump is obsessed with. Why do you think Trump is doing this?
Well, I mean, let me just begin by flatly stating that I believe that spending a penny on building a wall is like the most stupid, wasteful thing that we can do. Now, why is this president insisting on this? I think that it goes back, frankly, to far earlier than when Trump announced that he was going to run for president. We've been kidding ourselves as a nation since at least 1986, thinking that if we make the border scary, if we make the border become far more militarized, and if we build walls to literally scare people, that people will stop from coming. That's been an idea that has been part of our growing narrative about these issues. And Trump used that particular narrative to essentially conjugate, that narrative with many other fears. Some of them, I believe, are legitimate fears that many sectors in American society are experiencing, to essentially tell people, if you elect me, I'm going to build a wall. Mexico is going to pay for it, and that's how we are going to solve the migration challenges that we are facing. So the president is clearly committed to satisfy his own base to provide this kind of solution. Now, I have to say, sadly, that there has been, in my opinion, a lack of creativity in terms of how to respond, and put, the other side, the Democrats, but also many civil society organizations, more on the offensive, about this particular moment we are facing with the government shutdown. And I really believe that we must understand that the balance of power that came out of the elections last November, it continues to be one that is extremely detrimental for those of us who argue for evidence-based, fact-based solutions, because the Senate remains controlled by Republicans, and we still have a President Trump that, even if you lend any credibility to the notion that he may be impeached, it will still be a Republican administration until the end of 2020. And so this complicates how realistically can you possibly negotiate something that is, again, rational, that is evidence-based, and that makes sense.
If you were president of the United States, what would your immigration policies look like?
Well, first of all, I mean, I would definitely begin by acknowledging that the policies that we now have in place actually contain an architecture of political and policy responses that were, frankly, from the 1960s. So we need to acknowledge that we have to bring our immigration laws to the 21st century. We need to understand that the future of societies are now ever more linked, than in the past. And that therefore immigration policy cannot just be how we control people from arriving to our country. It has got to be also about what is driving people to leave their countries, and reconcile what we do on immigration policy, acknowledging that family unity is crucial, acknowledging that we need more people able to work in our country because we have our own demographic challenges with the baby boomers retiring. We need indeed a policy that acknowledges that nobody who has ever been here for more than 3, 4, 5 years is any more temporary. I mean, they are permanent part of our social, economic, cultural fabric. And I would also bring into the equation, and I know this is very difficult, but we need to be creative, the role of foreign policy, because our foreign policy has been part of the problem, and it needs to be part of the solution going forward.
I'm going to read to you an excerpt from an article that recently appeared in the British newspaper, The Guardian.
Mm-hmm.
Trump decided to shut down the government over the claim that America needs a wall to deal with a crisis at the border with Mexico. But there is no crisis on the border other than the humanitarian crisis of his own making. best illustrated by the thousands of children separated from their parents and the two children who died in Customs and Border Protection custody. Trump's claims of more terrorists and crime flowing across the border are lies, and the vast majority of hard drugs coming across the border come through official ports of entry, not between ports of entry where a wall might stand. Is this statement true?
Absolutely. I mean, I have said, very similar things in different interviews and in articles I've written over the last few months. This is a totally invented crisis. Nothing that Trump uses to scare people has anything to do, with the people that are actually migrating. And I could not agree more that when the president speaks of this crisis, he never speaks about these two Guatemalan kids who already died while in custody of the U.S. Border Patrol, nor does he speak of the pains of people who are truly doing what they are supposed to do, which is to come forward and apply for political asylum. We are denying, and by doing so, violating the law, very likely, the opportunity that these people are so desperate to try to secure for themselves and their kids. And so, again, I mean, I agree very much. This is an invented crisis that has nothing to do with the claims the president often makes.
You're listening to Kica's Corner on WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio, broadcast at 103.5 FM and live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. I'm going to pivot now, Oscar, since we're coming to the end of our show, to ask you a few personal questions. And these are questions I always ask of my guests. And I have to tweak these a little since you're from Chicago and not from New Haven. So so bear with me. The first question is, who are your sheroes or heroes?
From early on in my life, one important hero is a man that I had the pleasure, the fortune to meet personally, and who recently was actually elevated to sainthood by the Catholic Church. I'm talking about Oscar Arnulfo Romero, the slain Archbishop of El Salvador back in 1980. As I said, I mean, I met him, and from the first time I read about, his beliefs and his way of understanding the role of social justice, I became absolutely persuaded, by that perspective, which has stuck with me for my life and will continue to be with me until my last breath. In the U.S., I have also come to appreciate the life of important individuals that have been also important guides for me. Among them, I would definitely highlight Martin Luther King. We just celebrated his memory. And reading again, listening to his speeches, I cannot agree more about the validity of many of his statements back then to be still true today. Malcolm X, I mean, is another very important figure in my life. I mean, understanding especially racial oppression in the U.S. And to be honest with you, I have many, many more sheroes and heroes that are people I've come to know, many of them when they were very young and hardly would dare to take any stand on anything. And now I see them turn into powerful leaders. Those are the quiet, never necessarily to be known sheroes and heroes in my life that give me inspiration on a daily basis.
If you could pick a superhero power, what would it be?
That's hard. I think that the greatest thing I usually crave for is the ability for people to see reality for what it really is, based on what the evidence tells us, and not pretend that the world is the way I think or I believe it is, but to actually remain loyal to facts and evidence.
So, Oscar, I don't know if you know, but we in New Haven claim to have the best pizza in the country. And you talked earlier about, making decisions around policy and other matters based on facts. So we have some public opinion polls that validate my claim that we have the best pizza in the country. But being from Chicago, I'm going to guess that you might put up a defense for deep dish pizza. So let me ask you, do you prefer deep dish pizza or thin crust pizza?
I will eat pizza any night for sure in New Haven. I mean, I don't like deep dish pizza.
All right.
I've been in Chicago for nearly 20 years now, and I am still not convinced that that's the best Chicago has to offer.
All right. Well, when you come to New Haven, I'll take you to my favorite pizza place.
I would love to.
Finally, if you could be granted one wish, what would that be?
Oh my God. I would wish that every single human being in the planet understands that we have the same house, the same planet, and that it is our responsibility to care for it for the well-being and the future generations as well. And therefore, we need to be more responsible with this planet of ours, our mother, our house.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today on Kica's Corner, and a big thank you to today's guest, mi hermano Oscar Chacon of Alianza Americas. Oscar, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Kica, anytime.
Until the next time, here's wishing you justice, solidarity, and many, many days of sunshine.
Hello. We're done, I guess, right?
Yes, we're done. I'm going to send you a link, but that was amazing.
Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, but
No, my pleasure.
we're on at 4 to talk to the Four Freedoms Fund,
Yes.
right? Okay, cool.
Yes, I definitely